Greetings, fellow humans, and welcome to the Renaissance Yorkshireman podcast. Today, I want to make the first in a series of videos about education, partly because the changes to the education system that are necessary for building the post-capitalist societies of the future are of fundamental importance, but also because not only have I spent a lot of time in education systems as a student, but I was also a teacher for 20 years, more or less. And so I have a lot to say about education because I've seen examples of really functional education systems, and I've also seen examples of really dysfunctional education systems. I'm going to structure this video primarily in three parts. So the first, I'm going to give you some of my background as a teacher and as a student. Secondly, I'm going to give you a couple of quotes, one from Kate Tempest and the other from John Taylor Gatto, about their experience of education. And then I'm going to talk about the whys of education and really the philosophy of why we send children to schools and adults to universities. Not all adults, obviously, but many adults. And finally, I just want to talk a little bit about class size, because there are many changes that are necessary for functional education systems to be the norm rather than the exception. But one of the fundamental parts is class size. I grew up in York, which is part of the great county of North Yorkshire, and I spent a large part of the 1970s and the 1980s in primary education and secondary education in the UK. I went to Portsmouth University for 4 years in 1992, and I graduated in 1996 with a degree in Latin American Studies. After finishing university, I took a course in teaching English as a foreign language, and I got my CELTA, a Certificate in English Language Teaching to Adults, in 1996, and then I went off to Thailand to teach English. So since that time, 25 years ago, I've spent about 8 years in Thailand, 4 years in Oman, 2.5 years in Saudi Arabia, a year in Spain, and as a student, I also taught briefly in Mexico. And I've also spent more or less about 4 years teaching in the United Kingdom. Most of the time I've been teaching in the United Kingdom, it's been teaching foreigners. So often large groups of Chinese students and sometimes mixed nationality groups and other all nationality groups like all Italians or all Austrians, but a mixture of single language groups and mixed nationality groups. In addition to having taught English, I've also taught sociology, children's yoga. Bizarrely, I was a children's yoga teacher for about 5 months in Bangkok. I've also taught Spanish and French to English school children. I've taught classes on lucid dreaming. I've given a paper on the British Council Thailand's climate change project to a United Nations conference in Bangkok. I also have an extremely broad range of the institutions I've taught in and the age groups I've taught. So in Spain, I used to teach children from as young as 5 up to teenagers of 17, 18, as well as some adults. In Thailand, I used to teach a lot of teenagers. In Saudi Arabia and Oman, most of my students were 18, 19, 20 years old, so young adults. I've also taught groups of older adults, many in their 20s, but also adults who were much older. I have experience of teaching children, I have experience of teaching teenagers, I have experience of teaching young adults, and I have experience of teaching older adults. I've also taught at private language schools, I've taught in public schools in Thailand, I've taught at colleges of higher education in Oman, I've taught at specialist language units for the Saudi Arabian National Oil Company, I've taught in private language schools here in the UK, and I've also taught at York University here in the UK. All in all, my experience of a teacher is extremely broad, both in the types of students I've taught, the levels at which I've taught at, and the institutions I've taught at. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the philosophy of education. Why do we teach? And I'm going to give you 2 quotes to begin with. The first quote is from performance poet, rapper and singer Kate Tempest, who comes from London. And she says this about her all too common experience of secondary education in the United Kingdom. She says, "I just wanted to play music and listen to music and read books. I did want to learn, but on my own terms and at my own pace. I didn't understand why we were sitting in these classrooms doing stuff that I didn't care about. The whole thing seemed a farce and made me very angry and disruptive. In the end, I think they just got sick of me." And the next quote I'd like to read, both of which are from my book, The Tao of Sustainable Development, is from John Taylor Gatto. And John Taylor Gatto was a teacher. He's also a writer. And I believe that one year in the 1980s or 1990s, he won Teacher of the Country. He was a teacher in New York City. And if he's winning Best Teacher in the Country in the United States, he must be doing something right. And he says, "Is it possible that compelling people to do something guarantees that they will do it poorly, with a bad will, or indifferently, unless you are willing, as the army is, to suspend most human rights and use any degree of intimidation necessary? And if the latter is the only way that compulsion can produce results, what is the human value of using it if it diminishes the quality of human life?" The point I really want to get across with these two quotes is that so much of the educational experience of so many people, myself included, is absolutely farcical. It's a waste of their time. And these children who are in these classes, which are pointless to them, and they're sitting there thinking, why am I here? What is the point of being in this classroom? They are right to think that. The problem for the teacher in the classroom is that many of these students are then disruptive and cause problems. And then as a teacher, you have to deal with those problematic students. And then the time that you are dealing with those problematic students is time that you are not spending helping the other students who actually want to learn. But there's a number of issues here because, as I said before, these students are right to think that. But unfortunately, as a teacher, often you're thinking, they're right, this is a load of crap, but it's my job and I've been told this is the curriculum and this is what I must do and therefore I must get on with it. Many teachers are in this ambiguous situation where they're looking at the system that exists that they're teaching in and they're thinking, this really has a lot of problems at best, and often they're thinking, this curriculum and this system is absolute rubbish. And yet I have to do it. It's my job. If I get sacked, I don't get paid, so therefore I must just get on and do it. This is an absolute tragedy. It is an absolute tragedy for the children and it's an absolute tragedy for the teacher, and it is a waste of time. Of course, this is not always the case. Sometimes there are classes where the teacher is very good, the students all want to learn, and everything goes great. And those times can be beautiful. This brings us to, why do we really have an education system? And obviously, governments have a set of priorities that may well be different from the priorities of teachers and students. So what are the government's priorities? In no particular order. 1, to keep children off the street and out of homes. Governments need adults to participate in the economic system. And many adults are parents. If they have to worry about what their children are doing because their children are at home and both parents are off to work, then this is going to cause problems. The government thinks we'll put the children in school and then the adults can go to work. And to a certain degree, this is a reasonable thing to do. They also don't want children out on the street, because what are gangs of 12 and 13-year-olds going to do when they're on the street? Well, I guess some of them will get really bored and throw bricks through windows or go shoplifting. getting up to various kinds of petty crime, and governments would prefer not to burden their police forces with all this petty crime of young people because it takes them away from doing other things. So that's one reason for an education system. Two more reasons for an education system, and these two overlap. Sometimes they overlap a little bit, sometimes they overlap a lot. One is to inculcate narratives into children's minds so that they will accept government, for example. And another reason is the transmission of culture, because children get culture partly from their family, partly from television, partly from their peers, but also to quite a great degree from their schooling. And some of this transmission of culture can be very positive, some of it less so. And, there are big debates and culture wars going on about what should or what should not be taught. And I don't want to get into that here. But the transmission of culture can be a legitimate thing to teach children. Inculcating narratives, on the other hand, is a lot more problematic. Now, a Marxist or perhaps even an anarchist or libertarian analysis would say something like, the government doesn't want you to question why there is a government and how they are in power. They don't want you to question the power structures that exist within society. That's all true. Because the fact of the matter is, governments generally want a compliant workforce. They don't want people kicking up too much fuss and asking too many questions, because then people, after they leave school, might start asking things like, why am I doing this job for 40 hours a week and I can barely live? I'm paying rent so that when I get to the age of 60, 65, 68 and retire, I'll have nowhere to live. I may well be homeless, and my pension will not be adequate to have any kind of reasonable lifestyle. And those kind of people might go out and, start revolutions or counter political movements to overthrow the power structures. And as a general rule, governments don't want this. And the fourth possible reason for schooling is the transmission of knowledge and skills. In schools, in my experience, there tends to be a fairly narrow curriculum. You can have a choice of pick 8 out of 12 or 15 subjects and then get on with it. But it has to be said, there is a certain amount of knowledge and skills transmission that does occur in schools, and this can often be quite functional. However, I would argue that actually the amount of knowledge and skills transmissions that goes on is really probably in the region of, 10 to 20% of what it could be in a really functional education system. And that brings me to what is a functional education system. In my vision of post-capitalist systems, education plays a fundamental role. And there are two extremely important differences in what I view as post-capitalist education systems and in the current education systems. In fact, there's more than two, but I'm just going to talk about the two which I think are really of absolutely critical importance. So the first is curriculum. At the moment, we have a fairly narrow curriculum and much of it is compulsory. You have to do English and maths, and you have to choose one of geography or history, for example. But in post-capitalist systems, we need to have an extremely broad optional curriculum. So very little will be compulsory. Some language, some maths, but not that much. But the optional curriculum will be extremely broad. So for example, things like dance, tai chi, yoga, meditation will be on the curriculum of post-capitalist systems. But other more practical skills, such as basic electrical maintenance, so that people can fix things in their own house, bicycle maintenance, car maintenance, how to build a motorbike. There's all kinds of specialist areas which could be on an extremely broad curriculum. Martial arts, painting, stamp collecting. You name it, it could probably be on an extremely broad optional curriculum in post-capitalist systems. And the final point I want to make today is about class size. So before I talk about it, we have to differentiate about two different styles of teaching. One is the lecture style of teaching, where the teacher or lecturer stands at the front and they just talk about a particular subject. You can have 20 or more students in a classroom or in a lecture theatre, no problem, with this lecture style. And there might be some interaction because there might be some questions, but mostly it's the teacher or the lecturer talking to the students taking notes. And the other type of teaching is communicative classes. And I say this, maximum of 16 students per class in a communicative classroom. 16, why 16 and not 15? 4 tables of 4. You can split it into 2 groups of 8, you can split it into 8 pairs. So if you want to do games or activities with the students, it's extremely easy. As a teacher with 20 years experience, I can tell you that the logistics of classroom management is extremely important. But in fact, I think the modal and median number for students in a classroom should be 12. If you have 12 students in a classroom and you've got a good curriculum and a good teacher, those students are going to learn so much, especially if it's a subject that they like and are invested in. They will learn so much in the time available to them, maybe about 4 hours per day, 5 days a week. They will learn so much more than in the education systems that we have at the moment. And if learning and the transmission of knowledge and skills is not the single most important factor for having an education system, then you've got a crap education system. The transmission of skills and knowledge absolutely must be at the heart of any education system. And in most of the education systems we have at the moment, it's not. It's peripheral, which absolutely is a tragedy. Thank you for giving me your time today. Peace.